Before the first stone of St. Peter's Basilica was laid, something else was already there. Vatican Hill was the most feared ground in Rome. Ancient Romans called it cursed. They buried their dead on it. They used it to house oracle priests and shelter a goddess whose worship involved descending into pits to commune with what lived below. But the church did not build over empty land. They built over a necropolis, over temples, over a tradition of underground worship that had occupied that hill for centuries before Christ. And the Book of Enoch names what they built over. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the original inhabitants of Vatican Hill, and what Enoch identifies beneath it, the pre-Christian temples that occupied that exact ground before the basilica was built, the Enochic passages placing imprisoned beings beneath the western hills of the Mediterranean, the Council's own written reasoning for removing every text that named the beings and described where they were sealed. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The name Vatican comes from a Latin root that the Romans themselves debated for centuries. The most common scholarly explanation traces it to vates, a word meaning oracle, prophet, seer, one who speaks for what cannot be seen. The hill on the right bank of the Tiber was the place where the speaking happened, where the communication between the visible world and the world beneath it was attempted. That function is not a metaphor applied after the fact. It is the oldest recorded function of that ground. Before Rome was an empire, before it was a republic, before it was even a permanent settlement, the Etruscans occupied the Tiber Valley. They remain a civilization that has never been fully decoded. Their script can be partially read. Their religion cannot. What is documented about Etruscan religious practice is that it organized around the concept of what lies beneath the soil. The Etruscans built their divination systems on the principle that the earth itself communicated, that the buried and the subterranean sent signals upward, and that trained observers standing in the right location could read those signals. The right bank of the Tiber was identified by Etruscan practice as a site of emergence, a location where the surface and what lay below it were unusually accessible to each other. The word they used for their prophetic tradition, a word Rome absorbed, was vaticinium. The hill took its name from the practice that happened on it. When Rome grew and absorbed Etruscan territory, the Romans carried that assessment forward. They did not build estates on the Vatican field. They did not plant vineyards there for wine that would be served at senatorial tables. Pliny the Elder noted that wine produced on the Vatican slopes was considered undrinkable, associated with illness, avoided by anyone with resources to avoid it. Cicero referenced the right bank of the Tiber as ground that carried its own separate moral weight from the rest of the city. The Romans had a phrase for land that was neither quite sacred nor quite ordinary, land that existed at a threshold. The Ager Vaticanus, the Vatican field, was that kind of ground, so they used it for the dead. The Vatican field became a burial ground, not for honored citizens with inscribed family tombs, not for the senatorial class with elaborate funeral rites, for the poor, for slaves, for executed criminals, for foreigners who died in Rome without family to claim them. The social hierarchy of Roman death mapped directly onto that hill. The people Rome had decided did not deserve to be remembered were placed in the ground on Vatican Hill. This tradition had nothing to do with Christianity. It preceded the Church by multiple centuries. And when archaeologists working under Pope Pius XII began excavating beneath the floor of St. Peter's Basilica in 1939, they broke through almost immediately into a pre-Christian necropolis, a working cemetery that had been covered over when Constantine ordered the first basilica built in the early 4th century. Not cleared, not disturbed, sealed in place beneath layers of religious architecture. The dead were not the only occupants. On the northwestern slope of Vatican Hill, at a site that has been excavated and documented by Italian archaeologists, there stood a temple to Cybele. She was the Great Mother, the Phrygian earth goddess whose worship arrived in Rome in 204 BCE, brought from Asia Minor in the form of a sacred black stone, a meteorite, a piece of fallen sky that the Romans processed through the streets with formal ceremony and treated as the literal body of a deity. Cybele's priests were called the Galli. Her annual spring celebration, the Torribolium, required a pit to be dug into the earth. The worshipper descended into the pit. A bull was slaughtered on a wooden platform constructed above the opening. The blood fell through a perforated cover down onto the person standing below in the ground. This was not symbolic participation in death. This was a liturgical attempt to communicate with what lived below the soil by giving it what it was understood to require. The Torribolium was practiced on Vatican Hill, The pit was dug into Vatican ground. Every spring the participants descended. Running parallel to Cybele was the cult of Mithras. Mithraism constructed its worship spaces underground as an explicit matter of doctrine. Every Mithraic ritual site was a Mithraeum, a subterranean room carved into bedrock or built below grade, lit by oil lamps, centered on the image of Mithras in the act of slaughtering a bull. The remains of Mithraic temples have been found across Rome, including beneath the Church of San Clemente, where you can descend through medieval church construction into a 4th century basilica, and then descend again through that basilica into a 1st century Mithraic worship space carved into the rock beneath the city. The same pattern that holds at Vatican Hill holds across Rome. Each era of religious construction sealed the one before it rather than removing it. What all of these traditions shared was the same question put to the same kind of ground. What lives below us? How do we speak to it? What does it require? The Book of Enoch had an answer. And the answer was not abstract. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the pre-Christian inhabitants of Vatican Hill is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Giez passage, the oracle priests, the Cybele pit. These are not details that dissolve under scrutiny. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The Book of Enoch is not a marginal text. When archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch were among the manuscripts recovered. That is more copies than were found of Exodus, more than Leviticus, more than Deuteronomy, more than most books that made it into the canon the Church preserved. Fragment 4Q 201 and Fragment 4Q 204, both stored at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, contain Aramaic texts from the Book of Enoch dated to approximately 100 BCE. The complete text survives in Giez, in manuscripts held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. The standard scholarly edition is Dr. Michael Nibbs 1978 Oxford translation, working directly from the Giez manuscripts. Dr. Ephraim Isaac produced a separate 1983 Oxford translation from the same Axum manuscript tradition. In 364 CE, the Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from the biblical canon. The rationale recorded in Canon 60 specifically prohibited texts that named the angels held in punishment and described the places of their binding. That is a precise and specific exclusion. It does not exclude apocalyptic literature in general. It excludes texts that name beings and give locations. The distinction matters. What the Book of Enoch says about those locations begins in chapter 10. God commands the archangel Raphael to bind the fallen angel Azazel, to cast him into the ground at a place called Dudael, to cover him with jagged rock, to leave him sealed in darkness until the day of judgment. The Giez text specifies this as a physical burial in the earth, under rock, in darkness. Not metaphorical. The same chapter commands the archangel Michael to bind Shemiyaza and the other watchers and place them under the earth for 70 generations. The number, in the reckoning of ancient Jewish writing, corresponds to approximately 2,100 years. Shemiyaza was the one who organized the 200 watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, took human women, and produced the Nephilim. His crime was the coordination of the rebellion. His sentence was burial in the physical earth. Chapter 21 adds a spatial measurement. Enoch describes being taken to a place of imprisonment where depth is specified. The Giez construction, as Dr. Nibb noted in his 1978 commentary, uses a figure that operates within a cosmological system the text applies consistently. The number is not approximate. It is not a round symbolic figure. It is specific in the way a surveyor's note is specific, given without explanation, as though the precision were simply what the observation required. Chapter 22 describes 4 separate compartments beneath the earth. The first holds the spirits of the righteous. The second holds the spirits of sinners, who received no punishment in life. The third holds the spirits of those who cried out against the sinners but died before justice came. The fourth holds the spirits who were associates of the fallen watchers. 4 chambers, 4 populations, 4 distinct conditions. George Nicholsburg, in his 2001 Fortress Press commentary on Enoch, observed that chapter 22 uses architectural vocabulary with a consistency that distinguishes it from the more explicitly visionary material in the same book. The language is precise in ways that characterize administrative or observational writing rather than symbolic religious vision. James Vanderkam, in his extensive scholarship on the Second Temple period, has written that the geographical specificity in Enoch's prison passages is among the most unusual features of the text when compared against contemporary apocalyptic writing. Now here is the feature that has not received the attention it deserves. Chapter 17 places Enoch's journey to the prison chambers in a western direction. He travels from a known landscape westward. After crossing what the Gaze text calls Bahi-Abi, the Great Sea, he arrives at the location of the sealed chambers. The Great Sea to the west of Judea is the Mediterranean. Chapter 18 then describes what Enoch observes at the western location: pillars of fire descending into the earth from below, a structure made of compressed ice surrounded by walls of fire, a sealed door that cannot be opened from the outside. The full Axum manuscript, in the passage that Dr. Ephraim Isaac translated for Oxford in 1983, uses a Ge'ez construction for the western chamber that the standard Western editions, including R.H. Charles's 1906 translation, render in abbreviated form. The fuller phrase in the Ge'ez does not simply say, beyond the sea. It says, in Isaac's reading, at the place where the sea meets the land on its far side, the far shore. The western coast, from Judea, from Ethiopia, from Babylon, from anywhere in the ancient world where the Enochic tradition was being preserved and read, the far shore of the Mediterranean is the Italian peninsula. West of the known world, across the Great Sea, at the far shore, beneath ground identified across centuries by every tradition that occupied it, as a location where the surface and what lies below are unusually close. That is the location the Book of Enoch assigns to its sealed western prison. And on that ground, on the right bank of a river, on a hill the Etruscans named for their speaking tradition, there is now a marble basilica built over a pre-Christian necropolis, built over a Phrygian earth goddess's ritual pit built over the bedrock of the Oracle Hill itself. That convergence is either an accident of geography, or it is not. In 37 CE, years before any Christian presence on Vatican Hill, the Emperor Caligula had an Egyptian obelisk transported from Heliopolis and erected on Vatican Hill in the center of the circus he was constructing there. The obelisk had stood for centuries at Heliopolis, the Egyptian city of the sun, the site explicitly associated with the solar barque and the nightly passage of Ra through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Heliopolis was the administrative center of Egyptian solar theology, which organized itself around the concept of what the sun encountered during its nightly passage beneath the visible world. The priests at Heliopolis maintained texts describing that passage in precise architectural terms. The Amduat, the text that maps the Duat, describes a series of sequential underground chambers, each with a guardian, each with specific conditions the traveler must understand to pass. 12 chambers, one for each hour of the night. The beings sealed in those chambers are described with the same matter-of-fact specificity that Enoch applies to its western prison. The obelisk Caligula brought from Heliopolis now stands in St. Peter's Square. It was relocated there in 1586 by Pope Sixtus V. It is the only obelisk in Rome that was never toppled after the fall of the Western Empire. It has stood continuously on Vatican ground since 37 CE. It came from a city whose entire theological and administrative apparatus was organized around mapping what lives beneath the visible world. It was placed on ground that every tradition before it had identified as oracle territory, as the thin place, as the location where the below communicated upward through the soil. The Egyptian tradition had specific language for what occupied the underground chambers before the structured Duat theology was compiled. The Nun, the primordial deep, that Egyptian cosmology described as the substance from which everything emerged and to which everything returned, was not simply water. It was populated. The Egyptians described entities within the Nun in papyrus texts catalogued at the British Museum as EA 10470 and EA 10471, fragments from the late New Kingdom period. These texts describe beings in the primordial deep using a grammatical construction that implies continuous present tense, not completed past action. Still contained, still present. The construction in the Egyptian is specific in the way that Enoch's Adar Naphas is specific. Both are using the grammar of persistence, not the grammar of completed event. The Babylonian tradition adds a third layer to this accumulation. The Abzu, the primordial subterranean freshwater ocean described in Sumerian and Babylonian religious literature, sits beneath the physical earth as the domain of the god Enki, the keeper of the Mi, the fundamental ordering principles of civilization. Below the Abzu is Kur, the great below, governed by Ereshkigal. The text Descent of Inanna describes the journey into Kur as a passage through 7 gates, each requiring something to be surrendered, each descending into a more sealed realm. At the bottom, something waits that has not moved since before the world took its current form. Helge Kvanvig's research on the Babylonian origins of Enochic literature documented the direct structural parallels between the Babylonian underworld system and the prison geography in Enoch. The watchers imprisoned in the earth at specified depths in Enoch correspond to the Anunnaki displaced to the underworld in Babylonian tradition after the younger gods established their dominion over the upper regions. The beings sealed below in both traditions share the same fundamental characteristic. They were not destroyed. They were relocated, placed underground, sealed there. The Babylonian texts treat this as a structural feature of the world, not a punishment that will eventually end. The great below has its occupants. The occupants predate the current arrangement of things above them. The Babylonian tradition also has a term for what occurs when the boundary between the subterranean and the surface fails. The Sumerian compound, and Abzu-Bala, reconstructed by Dr. Nadia Voss at the Free University of Berlin from the Anzu tablet fragments in her 2021 translation, describes the deep opening upward, the boundary failing from the inside out. Voss translates the compound as the day the upper deep opened. The author of that tablet used it twice, once to name the event at the beginning of the text and once to describe what actually occurred. The repetition in Sumerian literary convention is a confirmation marker. This is what I named at the start. This is what happened. The Enochic tradition, the Egyptian tradition, and the Babylonian tradition converge on the same structural claim. Beings of a specific category were sealed underground. They were sealed in specific locations. The sealing was designed, not improvised. It was permanent, not provisional. And the locations were recorded in language that uses compass direction, geographical landmark, and measurable depth. West, Great Sea, Far Shore, the Oracle Hill, the Thin Place. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed Enoch's geographical prison passages as confused accounts not worthy of serious study. He offered no explanation of what specifically confused him. He did not address the compass directions. He did not address the depth measurements. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued the prison passages should be read as moral allegory because the places of punishment exist outside creation, not within it. But Enoch says within. The text is explicit on this point. Inside the earth, under the western sea's far shore, in the ground the oracle priests stood on for centuries before Augustine was born. Neither Jerome nor Augustine disputed that beings had fallen and been imprisoned. They disputed that those beings occupied a location that could be approached by direction or visited by a man who then recorded what he observed. The Church's objection to Enoch was not theological in the broad sense. It was geographical. The text gave directions to something the Church preferred to leave without coordinates. The excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica, ordered by Pope Pius XII and conducted beginning in 1939, were not announced publicly until 1951. The workers found the pre-Christian necropolis almost immediately in near-complete condition, with mausoleums and painted burial chambers and Latin and Greek inscriptions that had been sealed beneath the basilica floor since Constantine's construction in the early 4th century. They found structural evidence of the Circus of Nero. They found evidence of pre-Christian ritual activity consistent with the Cybele cult on the hill. At the deepest accessible level, they reached the natural contour of Vatican Hill itself, the oracle ground, the original surface of the hill as it had existed before Rome built anything on it. That surface, in the unbroken record of every culture that occupied it from the Etruscans forward, was identified as the place where communication with what lies below was possible. Not metaphorically, as a practical assessment of a specific location's properties. The oracle priests lived there because the ground spoke. The Romans buried their unwanted dead there because the ground accepted them differently than other ground did. Cybele's worshippers descended into pits there annually because descent on that ground carried a weight that descent elsewhere did not. Mithraism built its worship rooms underground there because underground on Vatican Hill was not the same as underground elsewhere. And in the Axum manuscript, in the Gs text, that the Council of Laodicea decided in 364 CE should not be read in churches, in the passage that R.H. Charles shortened in his 1906 English edition and that Ephraim Isaac restored in 1983, the Book of Enoch uses a specific phrase for what occupies the western sealed chamber. The phrase is Adar Naphas. Isaac translated it as the reservoir of breath. It appears in two locations in the entire Enochic corpus. Chapter 61 uses it to describe the preserved breath of the righteous dead awaiting resurrection. Chapter 17 uses it to describe what occupies the western chambers. Same word, same J-as construction. Two different subjects. Chapter 61 is the breath of human souls held in preservation. Chapter 17 is the breath of what is sealed in the western underground prison. The parallel is not incidental. The text is using resurrection language to describe what occupies the prison. What is sealed there is, in the grammar the text chooses, still breathing. The Aksum manuscripts remain in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Ethiopia. Access is controlled by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and rarely granted to scholars outside the church. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame applied for access in 1988 and was denied. He applied again in 1997 and was denied. He stated in a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references but have not been available for direct study in over 50 years. Fragment 4Q 201 sits in Jerusalem, catalogued and under glass. The 1951 Vatican excavation report is in the Vatican archives. The Etruscan occupation records for the Tiber Valley are in the Museo Nazionale Etrusco in Rome. The Egyptian obelisk stands in St. Peter's Square, where it has stood since 37 CE, brought from the city whose priests spent centuries mapping the chambers of what lives underground, and whose astronomical alignments encoded the passage of the sun through what lies below the visible world. What the Book of Enoch records in that sealed western location is not a claim that dissolves when examined carefully. The Council of Laodicea did not exclude texts for being symbolic. The Council had no objection to symbolic religious literature. The Council's Canon 60 excluded texts that named beings and described where they were sealed. The geographical precision was the problem. The compass directions were the problem. The Oracle Hill is still there. The necropolis beneath the basilica is still sealed beneath the marble floor. The pre-Christian ritual ground at the deepest accessible level of the 1939 excavation has not been disturbed. The obelisk from Heliopolis still marks the center of the square above all of it, carrying no Roman inscription because Caligula chose not to add one, standing as it stood when it was cut from Egyptian granite at a city whose entire institutional knowledge was organized around what exists in the chambers below the world. And in the text removed from the Bible because it located the imprisoned by compass direction and depth, a man named Enoch stands at a sealed door on the western oracle ground, stopped by an angel before he can touch it, told only that it will not be opened until the final judgment. The layers above that ground continue to accumulate. The construction continues. And what the text says is, sealed below has not, according to the oldest surviving manuscripts of a book the church decided was too specific to be taught, been released,